The social contract theory. Social contract theory is based on, or at least contemporary social contract theory, is based on the work of Thomas Hobbes in his work, The Leviathan. Social contract theory is an approach to morality that differs slightly from the approaches we've looked at thus far. First, social contract theory is one in which agreement of some sort defines our moral rules or our moral principles. So in a social contract theory, as the name implies, there's an agreement amongst individuals, usually amongst a group of individuals. Sometimes these agreements, as in some social contract theories, are actual agreements where people have sat down and decided on certain rules. And this is sort of what Thomas Hobbes has in mind when he's posing his social contract theory. Contemporary theorists such as David Gautier has a similar approach, morals by agreement, what it would be rational for us to agree to. So social contract theory is based on the idea that a justified morality or a justified social state is one in which we've all agreed to the rules that we're following. Now, for the Hobbesian contract theory, and this is the one that's presented in your textbook, there are three main components. There's an ontology of persons, and essentially an ontology of persons is just a fancy way of saying what people are actually like. So an ontology of person describes what motivates people, their psychology, their makeup. That's what an ontology of persons. So Hobbes has a very definite view of what people are like, what motivates them, what their interests are, and that's going to be an essential part of his contract theory. The second part of a social contract theory, which nearly all social contract theorists have, is what's called a state of nature. This is a description of the starting point for negotiations. So there are some contractarians who will argue that, well, imagine we're sitting down right now, knowing who we are with our current society and system, and we're going to decide on certain moral rules. Other social contract theorists say, no, we need to sort of posit an ideal state. What would it be like if we were in a perfect bargaining position where no one had the advantage over anyone else? And Hobbes, too, has a conception of what the state of nature looks like. And as we'll talk about, his state of nature is one in which there simply isn't any law or any structure or any government. Finally, then, for Hobbes, there's the laws of nature. Now, the laws of nature are the laws that operate within the state of nature. In some cases, for some theorists like Hobbes, Hobbes thinks that there are a limited number of laws that actually operate. And for Hobbes, these laws aren't really moral laws, but are more like scientific laws. So these three components are what we're going to look at. These form the basis for Hobbes' notion of a social contract. So starting with the ontology of persons, as I mentioned, an ontology of persons is an account of what human beings are essentially like, what motivates our actions. Now for Hobbes, what motivates human action is self-interest. We didn't cover in this course, although you can refer to it in your textbook if you're interested, the egoist theory. And egoism is the view that all human beings are motivated by self-interest. Or at least I should say all human beings ought to be motivated by self-interest. There's actually two types of egoism. There's psychological egoism, which is the view that humans are by nature motivated by self-interest. And there's also ethical egoism, which is the view that human beings ought to be motivated by self-interest, that they have no natural duties to others. So the only thing that you are morally required to do is look out for your best interests. Now, Hobbes actually takes psychological egoism very seriously. The psychological egoism that Hobbes believes operates is one in which we are concerned primarily with our own self-preservation. That this is fundamental to our fundamental desire that we all have. I'm worried about me. I'm worried about the stuff I need to survive to the exclusion of all others. So Hobbes doesn't just take this as something we choose, but is actually a part of what our psychology is like. Now, if that's the case, we need a morality that's going to be able to appeal to that self-interest. We're going to need to approach human beings in a way that doesn't assume that they care about others, at least in any substantial way. Hobbes does allow that we might have feelings for others, but he doesn't think that that feeling is strong enough to motivate us to do the right thing necessarily. That at the end of the day, what we're going to be most concerned about is our own self-interest, our own self-preservation. Finally, as part of his ontology of persons, a description of people, Hobbes also believes that there is a natural equality amongst individuals. Now, this may seem a sort of absurd assertion. How are people actually equal? We see people all the time. Some people are stronger. Some people are weaker. Some people are healthy. Some people are sick. Some people are smarter than other people. So how is it that Hobbes can claim that there's a natural equality amongst individuals? Well, Hobbes is actually claiming something much bigger than the sort of specific inequalities or equalities between people. It's not just size and strength. What Hobbes views as a natural equality is the following. There is no one human being that is strong enough, powerful enough to control all other human beings. A nice way of summarizing is to say, on a Hobbesian account, well, how are people equal in a Hobbesian account? Well, you've got to sleep sometime. So every one of us, no matter how strong we are, have vulnerabilities. A number of other people can sort of gang up on one individual. That's one way in which you can sort of maintain an equality. Another way of viewing equality is the idea that, in fact, we're all vulnerable at one point or another, such as you have to sleep. Right? There are times when your guard will be down, and that means that no one is strong enough, no one is powerful enough to keep all others at bay. Now, for Hobbes, what happens in his state of nature, which we'll talk about in a minute, is that individuals will conflict with one another. That, in fact, our natural state is to be at war between, or a war of all against all. The war between individuals is caused by, as Hobbes says, competition, diffidence, or distrust, and a desire for glory. So passions, as part of our nature, we are generally competitive. We are distrustful of other individuals because we know, in part, that other individuals are also trying to preserve their own interests, in fact, preserve themselves. So in the state of nature, there's going to be this competition for scarce resources. Again, when we talk about the state of nature, we'll note that there is no commerce. There is no division of labor. So there's competition for the scarce resources that are there. We don't trust others because we know their motivation is the same as ours. They're trying to preserve themselves. And there's a desire for glory. Now, whether that desire for glory is the most important, in fact, it's sort of difficult to see how a desire for glory is something that motivates us. But you can imagine in a situation in which, and we're assuming at this point that there is no civil state, there is no government, we're simply individuals, and what are individuals like, what causes conflict between individuals pre-social state, that desire for glory might be something that we want, if for nothing else than self-preservation, right? If others think I'm brave, if others think I'm strong, they are going to be less likely to attack me. So maybe as a good feeling, a desire for glory, being looked at positively by others is something that we as human beings want, sort of a selfish sort of thing. That's one reason why this might cause conflict. I don't want to lose face. The other reason might be very practical on a Hobbesian account, because my desire for glory is to make sure that others are less likely to attack me. Now, it also turns out that we have a desire for peace, that part of that whole self-preservation thing is my fear of death. Right? I don't want to die. I don't want to suffer. I don't want to be constantly on guard. So a fear of death, a desire for commodious living, that's for comfortable living, and a hope of attaining things by industry. Right? It would be nice if in a state of nature, I didn't have to worry about defending all my property and all my things. This would give me time to do other things. Right? So we get the arts, we get literature, we get science, because we have a certain amount of peace, right? There's a division of labor. There's an understanding that I can be pursuing other goals and not have to worry about either being attacked or wondering where my next meal is going to come from, or worrying about whether I have to make my own clothing or grow my own food and so forth. So in a civil society like the one we live in now, we can obtain things by industry, but that's only because we have some sort of social structure set up, some sort of set of rules that govern the way in which we interact with each other. Now, the third component, as I mentioned, was the state of nature. And this is an account of the natural state of man without any established authority, government, or morality. Now, for Hobbes, what the state of nature looks like is a war of all against all. It's a perpetual state of war. Now, why would this be in a perpetual state of war? Well, in a pre-social state, there is no overarching authority. There is no morality. So the state of nature for Hobbes is a number of individuals, all with self-interest at heart. What's motivating them is self-interest, a fear of death, a distrust of others, So put all these together, and what you see is this is not a particularly pleasing state. These are radically separate individuals who don't trust each other, who are fighting for scarce resources in the state of nature in which there's no overarching authority. There's no police force, there's no government, there's no morality. And that's how Hobbes actually conceives of the state, or the state of nature, I should say, as a lawless free-for-all in which individuals are allowed to pursue whatever their interests may dictate without any sort of restraint. Now, in the state of nature, as Hobbes notes, force and fraud are actually a virtue. So his description of the state of nature, and this is sort of a fairly popular notion, there's no culture, no navigation, commodious building, arts, letters, and a constant fear of violent death. He says, in this state, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So in the state of nature, we lack all the sorts of things we take for granted: building, arts, letters, navigation, trade, money. All of those things are gone in the state of nature with this constant fear of death. Our lives are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and there are no objective moral distinctions in the state of nature. That is to say, there's no right or wrong. If I look at you and you pose a threat to me, maybe even a perceived threat in the state of nature, in a Hobbesian state, I'm completely justified in killing you. I'm justified in stealing your goods. Why? Because you might say, well, isn't stealing wrong? And a Hobbesian would say, there's no morality. What do you mean wrong? What do you mean by stealing? We have no objective moral distinctions. The only time we get objective moral distinctions is when we sit down and decide to come up with a set of rules that will govern our actions. So for a Hobbesian, the only thing that's motivating you in a state of nature is that ontology, is that desire for self-preservation and a fear of death, the desire for commodious living, right? You want goods and things that you don't have, so for those scarce resources. But there is also, and that one sort of bright light in our ontology is the idea that we do want some sort of peace. We really would like it if there was a way that we could come together so that we wouldn't have to live in this sort of nasty state. Now, for Hobbes, the laws of nature are those things that operate in the state of nature. Now, we want to be careful because Hobbes uses the word law of nature and right of nature in a sort of strange way, a way that we don't normally identify with. Laws of nature for Hobbes are agreed to by all because they are rational and remove individuals from the state of nature. So that's what a law of nature would be. A law of nature is simply what all individuals, because they are rational, so we can possibly remove out of the contract theory those who are irrational, but those rational, self-interested individuals who look at the state of things and say, this is just not particularly good, those laws that we would agree to become the laws of nature. These are the laws that remove us from that natural state of war of all against all. Now, the right of nature, according to Hobbes, is more like a power and not so much a right. When we think of rights, we talk in terms of a right to freedom of expression, or our right to counsel, or a right to a writ of habeas corpus. All of those things are the things that we normally associate with rights, like our constitutional rights. For Hobbes, what he's really talking about in the right of nature is more like a power. As he says, it's the liberty each person has to preserve their life using whatever means our judgment or reason deem necessary. So the right of nature is basically that power we have to do whatever we want. It's a lack of, in some ways, a lack of restriction at all. A right of nature is just a freedom that we have because no one's there to enforce any sort of rule upon us, right? So if I'm in the state of nature and I say, gee, that piece of land that somebody else has been cultivating would be good, and I go and take that from them, I'm simply exercising the right or the liberty or the freedom that I have, an unconstrained ability to do whatever it is I want. Now, laws of nature are established when I agree to give up that right. So in a state of nature in which there's no morality, no law, what have you, everyone has this right. And that's the main problem with the state of nature, is that everybody does have this right. We can simply go after each other whenever we want. So for Hobbes, laws of nature come about when individuals realize that it's a good idea for me to give up that right to just take whatever I want, to do whatever I want, in exchange for the benefits of civil society. And that's what I get. I get a benefit from peaceful interactions with other individuals. So here's Hobbes's argument. All right, the law of nature tells us that we must preserve our own life. So by law here is a almost as I mentioned at the very beginning, a physical law, right? It's a part of our psychology that we want to preserve our own life. The natural state of man is war of all against all. So because of our psychology as well, on part of our self-preservation, that psychology also leads to us being in constant conflict with others. In a state of war, we have a right to everything in order to protect ourselves, including the person of another. So in a Hobbesian state of war, you don't have to stop at someone's goods. You can actually use the person of another to preserve yourself. That's perfectly justified. So in a state of war, we have a right to everything in order to protect ourselves, including the person of another. Therefore, as long as the right of nature endureth, there cannot be security for anyone. So as long as we operate under this freedom, as long as we operate in this state in which we just simply do whatever we want to do without restraint, we're going to have this sort of situation. We're going to remain in the state of nature. Therefore, says Hobbes, every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of attaining it, and when he cannot seek and use all the advantages of war. So for Hobbes, he thinks it's completely rational for you and I to sit down in the state of nature and say, look, this is a lousy state. We all have this right to do whatever we want. I'm willing to sit down and give up some of that right in exchange for peace. And if, by the way, we can't do this, we can't come to an agreement, then I'm going to go back and use the advantages of war. But Hobbes thinks the motivation to preserve life and the fact that we're rational and that we recognize that this is in our self-interest will mean that we will, in fact, try to endeavor peace, that we will agree to give up some of our rights in nature. So what are the first two laws of nature? Again, remember, the laws of nature are those things that come about when we give up our right of nature. So the first law of nature is to seek peace and follow it. That seems reasonable. The second, that a man be willing when others so too are far forth as for peace in defense of himself as he shall think it necessary to lay down his right to all things and to be content with rights commensurate with those of others. So once we agree that one law of nature is to seek peace and follow it, because after all, peace is in our self-interest, it's in our interest to preserve ourselves, that once we've got that law, the second one seems to follow. If I find other individuals who are willing to seek peace and follow it, then it's rational for me to agree to lay down my right to all things, as long as others do exactly the same. So commensurate with those of others, content with rights commensurate to the same degree or the same extent with others. So I'm not going to give up my rights for someone else to have more rights. But if we have sort of an equal share of giving up, then I should be willing to do that. Those are the first two laws of nature. And that, says Hobbes, will pull us out of the state of nature. Once we've done that, we now no longer have a war of all against all. So Hobbes' approach, and the Hobbesian contract approaches, and those approaches that have been built on the Hobbesian approach, are based on rational self-interest. So Hobbes' approach and argument is one way contractarians have attempted to justify particular contract arrangements. So a Hobbesian approach, when people talk about social contract theories in terms of Hobbesian approaches, what they mean is a rational self-interested approach. Now, there are other contract approaches which are not rational self-interest approaches, and these approaches are along the lines of Kantian approaches. So there are others who argue that we don't need actual agreement between individuals, and that all agreements don't necessarily have to make me better off. In other words, there are times when, for instance, I can come up with certain rules that will be followed, even if it means it doesn't benefit me. So with a rational self-interest, there has to be some benefit to me. Now, of course, there's a lot of overlap on these various approaches. Usually, a Hobbesian approach attempts to make the argument that by my losing out in a certain way, so I give up some of my rights or I give up some of my goods, in exchange for that, I'm getting a lot more back. There are contractarians who have a rights-based approach in the sort of way we think about it, that there are certain things you can't do to individuals, or that there are certain ways of treating people that we have to abide by even if we don't benefit from it. But for the chapter here on social contract, what's being presented is one of the very specific rational self-interest approaches. And there's good reason for this, because in a business ethics context in particular, we often resort to rational self-interest as a justification for a number of business practices. So the wealth maximization of the corporation is one in which we think, well, the action of the corporation that's justified is one in which self-interest is maximized, in which profit is maximized. And so we tend to view this as a sort of social contract with business. Well, our society recognizes that businesses have this sort of interest. This is what motivates them. This is then what's justified. Their actions are justified based on this. And then hopefully as we go through this course, we'll see that this is a flawed sort of approach, that rational self-interest and the egoism that it's built on is not necessarily the sort of moral approach to business that we want, that we might want to hold our businesses to a higher standard. But the Hobbesian social contract is very much amenable to the sort of structures that we've created for business. Now, one of the things that a social contract is supposed to do is solve what's known as the prisoner's dilemma. So, or at least I should say what social contract theory, as in terms of its morality, the morality that comes out of the contract, is supposed to solve prisoner's dilemma. Because rational self-interest really isn't enough in many cases to come out with the best outcome. So as your book mentions, the prisoner's dilemma, and there's a number of different ways of describing it, but imagine you and a partner have been caught doing a crime, and you're sent into separate rooms, and each of you are approached with the following deal. If you confess and testify against your accomplice, so let's say you're Agent A, and the authorities come to you and say, if you confess and then testify against Agent B, you will get no time in prison, and Agent B will get 10 years in prison, because they can't make the case without one of you confessing and testifying against the other. Now, let's say they go again. At the same time, they're going to Agent B and saying, Agent B, if you confess and testify against your accomplice, you'll go free, and your accomplice will face 10 years in prison. On the other hand, if you both confess, then you each get 5 years. And finally, the best outcome is if you both don't confess, they won't have enough evidence against either of you. They can only hold you for a year, in which case they'll have to let you go. Now, assuming your goal is to spend as little time in prison as possible, what should each of the prisoners do? What's interesting about the prisoner's dilemma is that the completely rational thing to do is not the optimal thing to do. You don't get the best outcome by looking out for your self-interest. So in the case of Agent A, it seems, well, what should they do? You might say, well, don't confess. If you remain silent, then and Agent B remains silent, then you're going to spend the least amount of time in prison. Except you're not going to spend the least amount of time in prison, because it's rational for A. The worst case scenario that you get by confessing is 5 years. The worst case scenario you get by not confessing is 10 years in prison. So if you're simply looking out for your interests, you wouldn't risk the don't confess. That's way too much time in prison. So the 10 years is going to dissuade you, and you're going to say, well, confessing is the only thing that makes sense. If I confess and the Agent B doesn't confess, well, then great, I get no time in prison. But the worst case would be as, well, I don't confess and they do, and then I get 10 years. So what I want, well, what's sort of off the table is the don't confess on both parts. It seems rational, you might think, but since you can't talk with the other person, since you can't trust that the other person will remain silent, your best option, not knowing what the other will do, is to simply confess and take the 5 years. Now, morality is supposed to be a way of solving it. The only way out of this dilemma is that if I can trust that Agent A and B will both hold to their agreement. And this is sort of what the Hobbesian contract approach attempts to do. Right? The Hobbesian contract approach is one in which we say, look, morality allows us to come up with a better outcome, the one-in-one outcome. But the only way, now Hobbes believes the only way this is going to be accomplished is by having overarching authority that maintains our agreements. In other words, we can have social rules, but we need someone to enforce the rules. And this is where Hobbes thinks that the sovereign would come into play. That once we set up a civil state with authorities that enforce agreements, that by enforcing those agreements, we come out with a much better outcome than if we were left to our own individual agreements. So for Hobbes, the solution to a prisoner's dilemma type situation is morality, but it's morality that's enforced by a civil society, some sort of enforcement within society. Advantages of the contract approach. There are several advantages to social contract approaches to morality. They solve a number of problems that we'll see as we go on in utilitarianism and in Kantian thinking that become problematic, that are actually weaknesses in other theories. So one of the problems that we face in other sort of moral approaches is what rules ought we to follow and how are they justified? So a rule is moral, according to the social contract theorists, provided that it results in protecting those things necessary for social living. A rule is justified if it is necessary if we are to cooperate for our mutual benefit. So a rule is justified because it's in our interest to follow it. It helps support those things that we need to live a good life. So in the state of nature, again, all of this is in the context of that state of nature argument, that outside of, or in the state of nature, things are so miserable that a rule that takes us out of that state makes us better off, protects those things that we find necessary for living, is a good rule. So it provides a notion of what rules are and what justifies those rules. Another problem for morality in general is, why is it reasonable to follow moral rules? If we look back to Plato, Glaucon in the Republic, Plato, through the character of Socrates, talks about the challenge posed to Socrates in the Republic, which is, why be moral? Why should I do the morally right thing? So for some, doing the morally right thing is just because it's the moral thing to do. But that's not a particularly satisfying answer. Why should I be good when I can be bad and get more in return? So the social contract theorist actually has an answer to this. It says, because it is to our own advantage to do so, and because we want to be able to count on other people to do the same. So why should I follow moral rules like you shouldn't steal, or you shouldn't harm others, or you shouldn't kill, or whatever? You should keep your agreements or keep your promises. Why follow those moral rules? Because it's to my advantage to follow those rules. And by my following those rules, it's more likely that others will be more likely to follow those rules as well. So it's reasonable to follow moral rules because it's to our advantage, and it gives others an indication that if we're going to do it, that it's to their advantage to do it as well. When can we break a moral rule? Oftentimes, when we talk about, for instance, Kantian approaches, Kant believes that moral rules are absolute, that there's never an exception to a moral rule. Well, I think that this is probably a notion that most people would disagree with, that there are times when you might be justified in, say, lying or deceiving someone, for example, maybe to save someone else's life. Or I can break a promise if I'm breaking that promise because there's some other more pressing moral obligation. So if I promise to meet you somewhere at a certain time, you might say, well, I'm sort of under a moral obligation that someone else is depending on me. Yet, if on my way to meet you, I see someone who's been in an auto accident and I need to stop and call for an ambulance, I think you would say, well, that my obligation to keep my promise was overridden by an obligation to help someone else. So the social contract theorist has a way of accounting for the breaking of moral rules. We are released, at least to some extent, from following the rules when others fail to follow it. So while I may have an obligation not to harm others, if others try to harm me, then I'm justified in not following that sort of moral rule. So for the social contract theorist, it's very easy to come up with, or relatively easy to come up with, exceptions to the rule. Right? If rules are about mutual agreement and others aren't keeping those agreements, then those are instances in which I may be justified in breaking moral rules. So these rules are not absolute, but they should continue to benefit me. Does morality have an objective basis? So we ask the question, especially with cultural relativism, is there an objectivity in ethics? And say, well, we don't see morality in the world. But we could sort of posit a sort of objectivity if morality is a set of rules that rational people would agree to for mutual benefit. If the rules lead to the sought-after outcome, then they are, quote-unquote, right. And this also seems to make sense. That if you have a set of rules that are justified, and that justification is based on something like human flourishing, or that there's a mutual benefit, that all people benefit by people following these rules, that our society is stronger, healthier, that individuals benefit from these rules, then we might have something like an objective basis. Now, it's true, of course, that the rules themselves are created, that we're not making a claim as a social contract theorist that we've discovered these laws in nature like a natural law theorist might posit, or someone else. But it allows for something like an objective basis for morality. After all, once you have an agreement, that agreement is something you can refer to. It's not something that's made up on the fly. It's something that we say, here is our set of moral rules and principles that govern us. And so there is something like an objective basis. At least it provides as much as we might expect from morality in terms of objectivity, something that we can point to as an objective basis for morality. Now, there's an additional advantage of the social contract theorist, and this is a justification of civil disobedience. So if we look at the social contract posits that morality and the rules that we live by are those that we agree to live by. Now, once we've agreed to live by those, it appears that unless someone else or the state has violated their end of the agreement, we are morally required to continue following those agreements. But then that poses a problem for civil disobedience. How do we protest certain laws or a certain social order, given that technically we've agreed to the rules of that society? So in the case of civil disobedience and the social contract, our obligation to obey the law stems from our acceptance of certain burdens and for certain benefits. So in a society in which we have certain rights protected, we agree to do things like support the state. So we need a judicial system and we need law enforcement and so forth. So in terms of supporting it, we obey the law, we accept the burdens of things like taxes in order to get the benefits from the social order. When we are no longer receiving the benefits while still bearing the burdens, such as paying the taxes or just following the law, we are justified in not obeying the law. Therefore, civil disobedience is justified. So if we think of the civil rights movements in the 1960s or the 1950s and 60s, we can see that, look, if I, as a black person in the United States, was paying my taxes, I'm following the law, I have my citizenship, I'm a member of the society in which I'm taking on all the burdens of that society, and yet I'm not getting the benefits. I'm not having my voting rights protected, my speech rights. I'm not allowed to shop where I want to shop or go to the school that I want to go to school, where I want to go to school, even though I'm paying taxes in that are supporting those public institutions. Then I am justified in civil disobedience. In fact, there has been a breakdown of the social contract. You are not providing me with the benefits that I agreed to while accepting the burdens of that society. So this social contract theorist has a lot going for it. Perhaps we disagree with the self-interest motivation. Maybe we think that there has to be something more robust than just it benefits me. But we can see that there's a lot that the social contract allows us to account for in morality. When to break moral rules, when we can't, justification of civil disobedience, what's the objective basis for morality. It's also a morality based on reason, although that reason might be somewhat limited because it's only self-interest. And we can look at justification in terms of human flourishing or benefits to individuals within a society. So what are the problems with the social contract approach? What we've presented so far seems to be a pretty good approach to morality. Well, there's a few problems that have been pointed out. And some of these, it depends on which sort of social contract approach you're dealing with. If we're talking about the rational, self-interested approach, the sort of egoistic approach of Hobbes, some of these criticisms go directly to that, but they also go to contract approaches in general. The first, and this one is specifically Hobbesian, or is more Hobbesian than other criticisms, is that the social contract is based on a historical fiction. Was there ever really a state of nature? Right? Was there ever a time in which there really was a war of all against all? In Hobbes' own writing, Hobbes starts out by saying, let's assume that human beings sprung up in the woods like mushrooms, fully formed and self-reliant. Well, clearly this isn't the case, right? I mean, human populations, human groups do not arise spontaneously, fully formed, and able to take care of themselves. Just simply ask yourself when you were born. It wasn't as if 3 days after you were born, your parents said, that's enough laying around. It's time to go out and get a job, right? We all depend on others. And we've always, it seems, human beings generally have lived in some sort of social group. So there is a sense in which we say, well, look, no one's ever really sat down and come up with a social contract. We've actually had something like agreements or fellow feeling or other things that have operated before that. So there's the historical fiction part. Now, even if we assume that there was an agreement, the question would be this contract that supposedly exists. No one has ever sat down and actually made up a contract. I mean, we can talk about the U.S. Constitution as something like a contract. But even that was based on other laws, British common law, sort of commonly understood or accepted notions of morality and right and wrong. So there really hasn't been a historical contract. But even if there was, why would I be obligated to follow the contract of someone else? Right? So if you think of the Hobbesian contract, I think Hobbes says, well, we all get together, we sit down, we agree upon moral rules. Well, you might say, I've never agreed to these moral rules. I've never said that I'm willing to follow this particular set of principles. Now, another problem with this is, given this historical fiction, or what might be viewed as a historical fiction, is what do we say about those who did not sign the contract or do not sign the contract? And this is problematic. Because on the one hand, Hobbes is saying, look, it is rational for us to do this, that if you sat down with others and came up with agreements, you would do this. But what about those who simply don't want the benefits of civil society? What do we say about them? Now, later contract theorists have actually worked around this by saying, look, what we're concerned about is what rational individuals would do. Or if they were in this situation, if they were acting out of self-interest, or if they were in this situation, what would it be rational for them to do? And in that way, we get around, or we use what's commonly known as hypothetical consent. What would they have agreed to had they been given the option? But for a social contract theory based on actual agreement, this is a problematic position. Do those outside the contract simply are simply not entitled to the same protections? Can we do anything we want with those who don't sign the contract, or are we still bound by the moral precepts that we agree to in the contract? So this poses a problem if you require actual consent to a social contract. So there's another part, and this sort of adds on to those who don't sign the contract. How about those who can't participate in the social contract? Who can't? So on the one hand, we could say there's a problem with people who don't participate. But what about those who can't participate? So non-human animals, the mentally impaired, or children. What do we say about their standing within social contract theory? So one of the problems for social contract theory has always been the issue of children, or the mentally impaired or mentally incompetent. If I can't agree to the contract, does that mean I fall outside of the contract? For some, that's actually the case. Hobbes has a means of reconciling this in the case of children. Hobbes thinks that children implicitly sort of consent to the contract. A child accepts food from their parents. A child accepts a roof over their head in exchange for obedience to the parents. So they've actually in some way implicitly agreed to a contract. But it's sort of strange to think of that as a contract, at least not an unforced contract. For Hobbes, any agreement that's in your self-interest is a justified contract. So if I say to you, agree to these terms or I'll kill you, for Hobbes, you have a real choice. You can die or you can agree to the terms. So Hobbes doesn't have a problem saying that a forced contract is illegitimate in some way. I think our contemporary thinking, in fact, I know our contemporary thinking is a contract that is forced, that you're coerced into agreeing to something, is not considered a valid or legitimate contract. But this does pose a problem. So from our contemporary standpoint, we look at these and say, wait a minute, I didn't agree to this. And in fact, as children, don't we often say, I didn't ask to be born? Well, what is that saying? Well, if we wanted to look at that philosophically, and one, it's the snotty kid who doesn't want to do something. But on the other hand, it really is sort of this idea that, look, you're forcing me to do something. You're putting me in a situation that I disagree with, and I never agreed to the terms of this. And so this does pose a problem for social contract theorists of the Hobbesian stripe. Now, if we Look at those such as John Rawls, who was a Harvard philosopher, wrote a book called A Theory of Justice. John Rawls has a contract approach that doesn't rely on actual consent. Rawls says, here is a state of nature, a conception of a state of nature. It's a very special state of nature, not like a Hobbesian state, in which individuals don't know anything about themselves. They don't know whether they're rich or poor, sick or healthy, male, female, gay, straight, religious, agnostic, what have you. They know nothing about themselves personally. And they're put into this original position, his state of nature, where they don't know anything about themselves. And then they're asked to decide how goods and rights and things will be distributed in society. And so in that position, if I don't know whether I'm going to be a child or an adult, if I don't know if I'm going to be rich or poor, healthy or not so healthy, then I have a slightly different perspective on what a justified social state might be, what civil society ought to look like. So if I don't know whether I'm going to be rich or poor, I might not agree to basing all healthcare on ability to pay. All right, so I might say, well, look, in a state of nature where I don't know who I'm going to be in a society, if I ended up in the worst off position in society, I want to make sure I have some basic things so that I can lead a pretty good life. So I might want to guarantee certain things are granted to me. I might want my civil rights. I want to make sure I can't be discriminated against. I want to make sure that I have access to education and healthcare and say some basic goods that I'll need to realize my conception of the good life, as we would call it, my sort of goals in life. So social contract theorists don't necessarily have to go by this self-interested approach that Hobbes does. There are other ways to get around problems of non-human animals or the mentally impaired or children. It's just that in a social contract theory like Hobbes, there isn't a lot of resources for doing that because it does depend on actual contracts between individuals, explicit contracts between individuals that set up our social state and define our moral principles and rules.